Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 208, Yiddish Nu? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And this is our look-back episode on the series that we've produced about Yiddish in America, along with the Yiddish Book Center. I should note that the Yiddish Book Center has been an incredible partner in getting the guests for this series and in helping us think a little bit about Yiddish, but the responsibility for the content is all ours. So we hope that you've loved it. And if you hated it, blame us. And certainly the Yiddish Book Center has had nothing to do with today's episode, in which we're giving our own take on Yiddish and the meaning of Yiddish. And I'm excited to jump into that with you, Lex. Before we do, let's just give our final update on the Kickstarter. Well, at least before the Kickstarter ends. We'll report into you on how it all ended up next week or the week after. But this is the last episode before the end of our Kickstarter. So to remind you, we are raising money to be able to create the first volume of what we hope will be a number of volumes of what we're calling Judaism Unbound Bound. Our book and our book series, in which we're going to take what we think of as some of the most fundamental, the most foundational ideas from the podcast and put them in conversation with one another in ways that they weren't necessarily on the podcast. Because sometimes when we've put out an episode, we've realized that it's really in conversation with an episode from 2 or 3 years before that a listener may never have actually heard. So we're really excited to be able to put these episodes in conversation with one another. And it's very Talmudic in the sense that the Talmud is a conversation among rabbis that actually never was. These are characters that lived hundreds of years apart from one another. And we are excited to have our book at least be a conversation among people who may have never met each other and certainly weren't adjacent to one another on the podcast. And we think we already know, because we're working on the book, that really interesting things are coming out of that. So you have about 5 days left. If you're hearing this on the day that it comes out, you have only 5 days left to participate in the Kickstarter. We were really excited to have achieved our bare bones fundamental goal to even make this project work. We achieved that in the very first week of the Kickstarter, and we've been thrilled that we have well over 100 supporters already of the project, and we have already surpassed our first stretch goal. So now we have put out another stretch goal, which is going to really allow us to make this book the maximum that it can be. And we are so grateful for anybody who contributes to the book in the next 5 days. We are super grateful to everybody who's contributed up to this time, and we are extra grateful for those of you who are going to contribute in the next 5 days to help us bring us closer and closer and perhaps over the line of our second stretch goal. If you go to the Kickstarter page, and you can do that by going to www.judaismunbound.com/book, there's lots of great stuff. And the most important thing of all is that you're going to be helping us turn Judaism Unbound into a book, which is going to be a great keepsake for you, hopefully a great gift for people that you know, and even more significantly for the project that we're all engaged in, it's going to be a way to share these ideas with people who don't listen to podcasts. So thank you so much for listening to Judaism Unbound, and thank you so much for supporting this project of turning Judaism Unbound into an old technology, books. So now let's jump into our conversation about Yiddish. You know, I wanted to start, Lex, with a little story about a conversation that I had with my grandmother of blessed memory quite a few years ago now. And she always kind of looked down on Americans from a Jewish perspective, not because of their lack of observance. She wasn't particularly observant herself, but because of their lack of knowledge of Yiddish. And she used to say to me, Americans are so ignorant, they don't even call it Yiddish, they call it Jewish. And I said to her, but wait a second, what does Yiddish mean? She's like, what do you mean, what does Yiddish mean? I'm like, well, what is a Yid in Yiddish? She said, a Yid is a Jew. So I said, and ish is just the same as it is in English, right? She says, of course. So I said, well, so wouldn't it be true that Yiddish means Jewish and they're actually not ignorant? And she thought about it for a second and she said, you know, what you say makes sense, but it's not right. So I think it's interesting to think about what the meaning of this series of episodes is in some version of translation. You know, what does it mean? Why are we looking at Yiddish? What could it mean to us in the future?
So that's all, those easy questions. That's what we look at in our Dan and Lex episodes. Cool. Yeah, I mean, it's been a fun journey these past bunch of episodes. And honestly, in terms of personal reflection, I didn't expect this to feel so personal to me. But I want to be clear about that. It's not that Yiddish feels personal to me because I have ancestors who spoke Yiddish. That's true, and that's not irrelevant. But there were ways in which talking about Yiddish, talking about this one particular subsection of Jewish life writ large, and playing around with all sorts of sides of it really helped me to think about what would happen if we did the same with other elements of our Jewish lives. And what I kind of want to do today a little bit is take some of the scattered moments where that happened a little, where I came to broader conclusions about me or about the world or about the Jewish world, and see if we can figure something out about them. We'll see. But so one moment. Okay. Shame came up. The idea of shame. And that was fascinating. With Naomi Seidman, we talked about that. And first off, I want to say that we didn't, as far as I can remember, use the Yiddish word shanda. But shanda is one of those classic words that even those of us like me that don't actually have the ability to say any sentence in Yiddish, like I know that word shanda because it's just like so ingrained in Jewish communities and in Jewish families that shanda is, something you refer to when there's something to be ashamed of, but like usually because of what it makes Jews look like. So Bernie Madoff is one example of, say, a shanda.
Yeah, and I think there have been a number of other examples in the last week or two.
Yes, that is certainly true. But so I wanted to think about the specifics of that episode about shame, not so much this shanda piece, but something came up that felt so similar to broader conversations we've had without thinking about Yiddish at all. So what happened was Naomi Seidman was talking about, along axes of gender, that there were these men who sort of the societal expectation was that Jewish men would know Hebrew and Jewish women would not know Hebrew. Now, the reality was such that Jewish men lots and lots of times in lots of different eras and contexts didn't actually know Hebrew in any kind of deep way. They couldn't have read a book in Hebrew. And so there was this whole issue where Jewish men would in secret read books that were meant for women, these Yiddish books that were meant for women, but they wouldn't tell anybody. They felt ashamed about that fact. And I heard her say that, and I thought to myself, wow, that's a story that is so relatable today. That's a story that relates so directly to all the articles and voices and people that talk about not feeling Jewish enough. Feeling that on whatever axis, whether it's I don't know enough about the Torah, I don't know Hebrew, that's literally what this was, I don't know Yiddish. It's kind of ironic on some level that not knowing Yiddish, given that past story, is now kind of a way of not feeling Jewish enough. But like there's all of these ways that we police ourselves and feel like we're not authentic. I didn't expect Yiddish to bring up that conversation, but it was such a clear-cut way in which this moment of the past where men felt ashamed because they didn't know this masculine language of Hebrew, but did know what was seen to be a feminine language, Yiddish. There's a lot for us to think about in how we relate to that same set of issues today.
Yeah, and it's both that there's this idealized image of the present, right? Like at that time, at their present, they thought, I should know Hebrew, but I don't, so I'm ashamed. And we obviously have that too. That's what you're saying. We are dealing with that all the time where we feel ashamed. We know others who feel ashamed that they should know something Jewish, but they don't, so they feel a sense of shame. And on this podcast, we're trying to say, don't feel ashamed. But there's also the piece that, for me, it's kind of empowering to know that in the past, it wasn't any different. There's this idealized notion of the past, and it's certainly one that is put out there by more traditional elements of Jewish society that say, oh, in the past, everybody was educated, everybody was Orthodox, everybody knew Hebrew, everybody went to synagogue, everybody felt close to God. And now we live in this degraded time in which there are so many people who don't know these things and don't connect with these things, etc. And that's not the truth, right? The truth is all previous times of Judaism were just like our time, where there were lots of people who didn't know, lots of people who didn't like. The difference is they were kind of stuck. This goes back to our early episodes, right, where we talked about the importance of the emancipation and why it's the emancipation of the Jews that has led to a lot of the challenges that we're working with today, because for the first time in Jewish history, if you don't like it, you can leave. And we're trying to say, yeah, you can leave, but you can also try to make it better. It's so empowering to me to kind of realize, and this isn't the first time I've realized it, so many times, whenever you study something about the Jewish past, you realize that it was not the unitary form that a lot of players talk about it as being, because it suits their political interests today to pretend like the past was unified and our time is sadly not.
Yeah, how we think about the past and how we falsely tell stories of it is important here. And it flashes me a little bit to the first episode, to Aaron Lansky's episode, because his story starts with a massive misconception about the very recent past. So you're talking about how we look at, thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago, everything was fine and dandy and Jews were educated and yada, yada, yada. Aaron Lansky talks about how people somehow convinced themselves that there were only, what did he say, 60,000, 70,000,
like that,
70,000
I think, yeah.
Yiddish books anywhere to be recovered that would be salvageable. That's all. And then he started his work and they passed that threshold super quickly. And they now have recovered like 1.5 million books in Yiddish. That, I think, reflects a bunch of things. So A, that's a cool story, right? So on the one hand, great, like that's empowering and awesome that like we thought that we had so little in a particular realm of Jewish experience, this being Yiddish literature, the actual documents of Yiddish literature. And turns out we've got lots more. We could say that that's just like a nice feel-good story, but I actually think that's a reflection of like we have this pessimism. So it goes in partnership with what you just said. We have this idealizing of the past that we do, but that very action of saying, the past is so good, almost always gets paired with, woe is me, the present is not that good. And I want to ask that same question about other elements of Jewish experience. I hear people sometimes talk about, there's no Jewish art historically compared to like other religious art. And there's scholars who write about this and question that. But like, I think the conception is, we've got way less of that than other religious traditions do. And so A, I'd ask the question, is that actually true? Have we really dug into that? And B, I'd ask the question, what are we counting as Jewish art and what aren't we? I think it's fair to say that we've got a lot more rabbis writing down conversations they had with each other than we do rabbis drawing or painting or sculpting things that we have inherited. But that doesn't mean that other people weren't doing it. Were Jews doing such things, but somehow not being seen as quite as Jewish? Like, that's a question I have. So that's a scattered bunch of things, but I'm curious how we can look at this Yiddish example and reflect on the pessimism that fills us about our current reality that, Jewish institutions are dying. Judaism is dying as a result of that, which of course you and I don't think is necessarily a correlation. That all came to light through looking at Yiddish, which surprised me.
Even to take your example further, right, it's interesting because when you think about the story that Aaron Lansky was told that there were only 70,000 Yiddish books that were recoverable, but it turned out there were more than 1.5 million. The question is, why were there more than 1.5 million? And I think there are two reasons, but we tend to focus only on the first one, which I think the story, as people hear it, is, there were so many more books preserved than we thought. We thought they had all been lost, but it turned out that they hadn't all been lost. And what a miracle, what a wonderful thing. But I think that it's also the fact that there were more books ever produced than people thought. When they were imagining how many Yiddish books were ever in production, they were looking at it in a kind of elitist way and saying, well, look, most of the Jews weren't reading a lot. They weren't readers. They were farmers. They were whatever. And it turned out that they were reading. Now, I'm really curious, and we didn't pursue this question deeply. Maybe we can at another time. Like, what kinds of books are the ones that there were the most of? I'm thinking about if we're looking at today's literature, is it that they were finding that there were so many more copies of, the equivalent of Dostoevsky than we imagined? Or were they, finding that there were way more copies of the equivalent of, John Grisham than we might have thought? And I don't know the answer to that, but if it turns out that it's John Grisham, right, there's something to be said about that. And I know that I've been raising questions about high culture versus low culture and all of that stuff. But I think that, and I think that there's something important in the question of, well, what really is important? Like, is it important to society to preserve the John Grisham? Isn't the most important questions in Dostoevsky? And really, so it's more important if we sort of make sure that we preserve that part of the literature? Maybe, maybe not. But the one thing that it does tell us is that we have to give the people a lot more credit than they were described, because they may not have been reading Dostoevsky, but they were reading. And right, they were serious people who were engaged in ideas, engaged in literature. And that's what I want to, again, take that back to today. There's so much, if you read the studies today and you know, how people think about what it looks like for Jewish life to be thriving today, it involves the version, I think, a version of that they're reading Dostoevsky, meaning they're going to the institutions that we have deemed to be the important ones. And if they're not going to those institutions, then we're failing. It's not working. All of Judaism is going to, as opposed to, I can imagine, right? Imagine in 100 years from now, the Aaron Lansky of 100 years from now, who's going to go around the country and he's going to find that, hey, it turned out that 100 years ago, American Jews were doing X, Y, and Z, and were so engaged in Judaism, and nobody even recognized that as being engaged in Judaism. So in a way, like, the question is, what are those things? You've raised, for example, that they're on Jewish Facebook groups. They're engaging in Judaism in really serious and substantial ways, just not in a way that the existing infrastructure is able to see.
Oh, man, I want to reflect on all of that. So the high culture and the low culture piece. First off, Yiddish is a hilarious landscape to try and look at high culture and low culture, because I can't decide which way it goes. Like, I feel like you could make the argument that all of Yiddish culture is high culture, and you could also make the argument that all of Yiddish culture is low culture. And I don't mean either of those disparagingly. I think you could hear that as, oh, somebody's saying it's elitist if you're calling all of it high culture. And on the other hand, you could hear it as, oh, you're saying it doesn't matter and it's trashy if you say it's all low culture. But I mean that, once again, I'm not a fluent Yiddish speaker, but the Yiddish immersion that I have had, which is a small amount, but a non-zero amount, it seems to almost purposely, very intentionally blur the line between the fancy, the high, and like the everyday, the mundane, the low. It seems like a characteristic of a lot of these stories is to sort of take the big important people down a peg, take the common people up a peg, mix genres that we might think of as classic and important. You're talking about Dostoevsky, but mix that kind of stuff with, like, I don't know, we talked about a play where there's like a brothel at the core, and this is like a celebrated Sholem Asch play. And I think there's something Yiddish about that, where you'd create this high art, this theater out of a brothel. And I love that, by the way. It feels comparable to other parts of Jewish experience where, on the wedding day, you break a glass because you have, even on the happiest of days, you sort of mix in a little bit of not so happy. All sorts of teachings. Tisha B'Av, the fast of the 9th of Av, is this catastrophic day, but like actually people think the Messiah is going to be born on that day. It's like you mix this high and this low, this good and this bad, and I feel like Yiddish is a unique context where that happens. So I'm glad you brought up the high culture, low culture point, because I think it's actually perfect that it gets complicated in this moment. So there's that. The other thing is that you were talking about how would we answer the question, what's Jewish that doesn't seem Jewish? So you were talking about how people are already doing X, Y, or Z. They're already in Facebook groups. I would love, I don't have these texts. I wonder if they exist, but I would love to find the versions of Jews either in Europe or in the US that are talking in Yiddish and bemoaning, nobody knows anything. Nobody is 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300. I'm sure those texts exist because in every era of Jewish history, we do that. But here, they are literally in that moment surrounded by people that were talking in Yiddish regularly. But in a world where so many Jews speak Yiddish, speaking Yiddish isn't meaningful. It doesn't feel like you're doing a Jewish thing when you speak your first language. Like you're just talking. And so all of that is to say, like, what is that for us? Because right now we look back at 200 years ago and we think, oh, it was like this deeply Jewish universe where people were talking to each other in Yiddish. But like a lot of those conversations were just about whatever random stuff of their lives. They weren't necessarily always talking about Passover or talking about Shabbat. Like, and I get that linguistically there are ways in which Jewish holidays and whatever like flow into the language. I'm not denying that. But my assertion is that in 200 years, people are going to look back at us and something very basic that we do, that could eventually be seen as Jewish. And so whatever you're doing, whatever you think is not authentically Jewish, whatever your life is that you think you don't know enough or do enough, know that in a few hundred years, there's something about what you're doing that people are going to look at and say, that's like deeply, obviously Jewish. We just don't see it yet.
Yeah. Well, first I want to just sort of mention a story that happened to me in college that is only now kind of dawning on me, that it was a significant story, although I'm not totally sure that I know what to make of it yet. But my first year in college, one of my roommates who was not Jewish somehow was at the library and came back to our room with a book that he had found in the library that was Yiddish curses, translated into English. And I'm not sure if he brought it back as a joke or he was doing some kind of research project where the book was actually legitimate or whatever. But he didn't mean it in a negative way at all. He just thought this was the most hilarious thing. He thought it was awesome that there were all these incredible Yiddish curses. And I opened it up, and I had come from like a substantial Jewish education and a substantial family background where people spoke Yiddish and everything. And I was reading this book, and they were the most foul, the most unbelievably disgusting curses that you could imagine. Like, just imagine, whatever comedian today is just the most foul-mouthed, horrible comedian, and that was what was in this book. And I was sure that this book was fake, was like made up, that, that it was a joke, that somebody in English had come up with the most horrible curses and then translated them into Yiddish. And it was like for fun, and nothing wrong with it. But that I thought that this could not be an authentic collection of Yiddish curses. They were just too foul. It would not be possible. And I think that from this vantage point now, looking at it, I again feel like something that I have said before in the show, like I almost feel robbed of a Jewish education in a certain way, right? And in a sense like that you could say that I was blessed with one of the best kinds of Jewish education because I had a lot of Jewish education in my youth, and yet I had not only no idea that there was an element like this of Judaism, but I was so sure that there couldn't possibly be, because all of the Judaism that I was taught was all of this, high culture stuff, the ethical principles and all of that, religious practices, that I was sure that like this couldn't even be possible. And so clearly I was miseducated, poorly educated, uneducated, right? And so how is it that I am more educated than some other Jew who didn't have the education that I had, but could pick up this book and say, yeah, of course, that sounds like stuff that I talk about with my friends. So it's no surprise that they would be talking about it in Yiddish. So there's something to that, right? Where our concept of what Judaism has been is missing a lot. And we do have access because of, Jewish education, emphasizing it in day school for sure, and also in Hebrew school. We have sort of more access to the Judaism that was developed in Aramaic and in Hebrew long before that in a way we're kind of skipping over hundreds of years of Jewish history as if they were just completely erased and never existed. And the only sense of them having existed at all is if there's some kind of echo of them that lasted longer, but we have no primary access to them at all. And that just feels like anybody who is out there saying, I don't have a good enough Jewish education because I haven't studied Hebrew or because I don't know all the prayers, I would say maybe it's true that you don't have such a good education, but it's not because you don't know Hebrew and don't know the prayers. It's because you don't know Yiddish and you don't know the culture of Judaism of the last 1,000 years that was done in Yiddish. The point isn't to know the language of Yiddish, but the point is that you don't really have access to that whole culture. And so then the question is, what do we do about it? Because the fact is that all of us are uneducated.
I both agree with everything you just said to my core, like big old agreement. But I would argue you weren't uneducated. I think you were partially educated. And I say that because I think all of us are partially educated. Even the best educated people are partially educated because you can't be fully educated. And what I want to name and what I think is so clear from this unit of conversations is that educators make choices. What you received in that classroom was a set of choices. So you got the high culture stuff. You got the Torah stuff and the mitzvah stuff and the ethics stuff. And you didn't get the Yiddish curse words because people made a choice about that. It could have been a good choice. It could have been a bad choice. It could have been a neutral choice. They made a choice. I think that is of deep consequence for us to really internalize, because what that means is every one of us, so certainly those who are actually educators in classrooms, but even not educators in classrooms, even those of us just talking with friends, and, if we talk about X celebrity in every conversation and we never talk about Y celebrity, that in the grand scheme of the universe makes X celebrity a bigger deal and Y celebrity more likely to disappear in our consciousness. So why am I saying this? Who cares? I think specifically to the translators at the Yiddish Book Center. So I think they've got dozens upon dozens of these people that are translating texts and trying to get a tiny fraction of all these texts that they have translated into English. And they have the worst job. I mean, it's the best job, but they have the worst job as a prerequisite to the best job, which is they have to choose which ones. They have to choose which Yiddish stories, which Yiddish works of literature are the ones that are most important for people who are not Yiddish speakers to have. And so that's like a micro choice, right? So they have to choose, they have to make a value judgment. That's what it is. They have to prioritize one text over all the other texts. If it's a translator who's going to spend the rest of this year on one book, they have to choose one. That's a really explicit, obvious example of a prioritization. We do it all the time in Jewish life. This actually ties to Tony Michaels' Lost Causes thing. It's like we have certain winners and certain losers in the scheme of history, and certain things disappear. And the educators in the classroom that educated you, they were making a choice about what they would prefer to disappear and what they would prefer not to disappear. And it's not that they were saying, screw you, we're going to keep you from this realm of Jewish stuff. It's that they had to choose something. And so they made the choices that they did. So the only thing I'm getting at here is that we have done this in Jewish history over and over again. You and I have been playing with the Book of Jubilees a little bit. And to me, it's a great tragedy in Jewish history that the Book of Jubilees was cast aside. There was an era in which a lot of Jews did connect to this text, and then a little while later, they didn't anymore. And I'm very sad about the quote unquote educators and the people that made that decision. Now, I can't tell them they're wrong. I can't tell anybody they're wrong, but we make those decisions and they have consequences. So it's just a matter of really taking that process seriously and saying, wow, we have power here.
Yes. The only thing that I want to add to that is that one has to ask why they made those choices. And maybe that brings our two topics together, because what I want to say is, again, it's not Yiddish per se. It's Jewish culture of the last hundreds of years. The reason they chose not to teach that was because of shame. And and instead, what they taught was that was almost a mistake. We should go back. You're right. Let's erase that period of time, or say it was a sad time. It was diaspora. We were poor. We were whatever reason. But it's not important. Let's go back as if that time never happened. And what we're going to teach is going back to the Talmud and the Torah. And not saying that you shouldn't study the Talmud and the Torah, but that we're just not going to even touch this period. And that notion, which I hadn't put my finger on, right, but that, even in the time that it was around, that Yiddish was associated deeply with shame, actually jibes with this idea that, the reason why people have sort of tried to skip it over when they were able to, when they did come to a new place, was also because of shame.
I'll do this quickly and then move on, but I'm going to do one of my interlingual Lex translations, which is that Noah has 3 different sons, and the one that Jews descend from, his name is Shame. That's his Hebrew name.
Right.
And I would encourage us to hear that as literally in English, we are descendants of shame, which I don't mean disparagingly, by the way. I think that it is a natural part of human experience, but I also think it's something that we should really wrestle with. Like, how does that shame manifest, and when do we allow it to overtake us? That bracketed.
Sometimes I think your interlingual things are a little bit extreme, but this one I like. I just wanted to mention, because it connects to what we were talking about in terms of the Yiddish curses and that whole part of Jewish history and Jewish culture, that my wife and I have been studying this daily page of Talmud for the last month. It's a cycle every 7.5 years. It was only started in the 1920s, even though people are talking about it like it's some thing that was given at Sinai. But it's this idea that you should read one page, which means a folio page, 2 sides of the page of the Talmud every day. And if you do that, it takes 7.5 years to read the whole Talmud. So my wife actually initiated this. She was interested to see what was in there, and I thought that would be interesting too. Subsequently, I've tried to quit like 3 times, and she's made us keep going, and I don't know how long it's going to last. It's controversial. B'nai Lappi doesn't like it. You don't like it. A lot of people don't like it. But I thought it would be interesting to sort of find out what's in there. And so far, it's been kind of interesting and revelatory. But one of the biggest revelations has been the amount of, let's call it, low culture that's in there. That sometimes it's framed in the language of high culture, like this whole first part of the Talmud is about like when you're supposed to be able to say the Shema, like under what circumstances and everything. So you could think, oh, what's higher than the Shema, but then it's like, can you say the Shema when there's urine around? Can you say the Shema when there's poop around? Can you say the Shema when you've had a seminal emission? There's
Can you
all
say
kinds
it with a fox? Can you say it in a box?
Yeah, and then there's like stories about some rabbi going around, actually a very famous rabbi going around like waving the bone of his dead son in people's faces who are like complaining, and he's saying, you think you've got problems, this is the bone of my dead son, and it's like, on the one hand, you could see it as tragic, but it's also kind of comic. I mean, just the idea that this stuff is going on. But what's fascinating, what's been fascinating to me so far is the Talmud is kind of full of this stuff that may not be quite as curse-like as this book of Yiddish curses. It's not meant to be curses per se. But it's like full of this stuff that's just kind of like very, I don't know what you would call it, very day-to-day, very human, very close to our bodies, and all this stuff, which again, I feel like I was kind of educated, right? Even in school, when we studied the Talmud, we didn't study these parts of the Talmud. We studied, what should a trial court do when there are only 7 witnesses, whatever. And it's just fascinating to realize that Judaism has been made up as much of this just real life. This is how we live. This is how everyone lives, as opposed to, again, another element of the shame, where I feel like a lot of us grow up Jewishly with the sense of shame that Judaism is about how you should live your life in the right way. And if you're not living your life in the, quote, Jewish way, then you should be ashamed. And it turns out that the Jewish way is also full of all kinds of ways that we live our lives, that everybody lives their lives. So it's just kind of, interesting to sort of make the connection between this Yiddish series and the Daily Talmud study, which I had not made until this conversation.
So you hinted very briefly that a bunch of people don't like this idea of learning a page of Talmud a day, and that you've tried to leave this process even a few weeks after starting a few times. I get that. And here's my issue with it. I don't have any methodological problems. I'm not like B'nai Lappi, who I think she doesn't like it because it's a different way of doing Talmud study than what she would advocate for people to do.
Well, it's because you end up emphasizing the content rather than what she thinks is really the most important, which is the processes.
Right. And so that's totally fair. My reason is I would love this practice. I would sing its praises to the rooftops if we also had 613 other 7.5-year cycles of Jewish stuff that we did. So if it was, there's a daf yomi, there's like a daily practice of, let's take Yiddish. I mean, we're going to make a 7.5-year cycle of the most awesome works of Yiddish literature. And you're going to read, whether it's a page or a chapter or I don't know, like you're going to read a small amount a day. And over 7 years, you're going to have this deep, incredible immersion to Yiddish culture. You could learn a Yiddish swear word a day.
That'd be awesome.
What if we did the same thing with, you're going to watch an episode, or a full episode is a lot of time commitment if you do it every day, but you're going to watch part of an episode of Seinfeld, and then Transparent, and then Broad City, and then Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. We could go down the list and say, here's a million realms of Jewish experience that would benefit from somebody diving into them for 7 years. By the way, I also don't think 7 years is realistic. I would like this more if it was 1 or 2 years. I think that You just don't know what your life's going to be like. But if we had 613 versions of a 1 year long, 365 day something, that would be awesome. And then Daf Yomi would be one of them. It would be one of those options. And I say that's awesome. For the people who really vibe with Talmud study, that's great. They've got this practice to do that. But there's so many people who, going back to this authenticity thing, this bad Jew thing, this shame thing, there's so many people who think, I being these people, I have a desire to have a rich Jewish experience that's a daily part of my life. How am I going to do that? And right now, the only commonplace answer for like what a deeply held Jewish ritual for daily practice would be Daf Yomi, would be the study of Talmud every day. Or you could argue like prayer every day. If you did traditional prayers every day, that would also be one of these. Is it really that Talmud is so unique, or that Yiddish is so unique, by the way? Like, is it really that any of these realms is so unique and so perfectly positioned for daily study that we couldn't also do it for some other realms of Jewish experience? Do we really think that you couldn't also do this for the Dead Sea Scrolls, or for you could just, we haven't even talked about going through like the Torah text. Like, you could do this with absolutely anything. And by the way, you could also do this with stuff that's not directly Jewish. Like the floodgates open when we allow ourselves to say, the magic here, and this is B'nai Lappi, the magic here is not the content on these pages, but rather the idea that you would regularly engage with it. And so you can map that onto every part of Jewish experience.
Yeah, Lex, I'm really into your ideas today. So in all seriousness, I think we should do this. Like, I think we should make some of these ourselves, but we should like open this to our listeners. So anybody who's interested in
Nice.
this, like, let's make a page on our website that somehow offers these different daily practices. By the way, I should note that there is a Torah version of this, a Bible version of this called 929,
Yeah.
and everybody should look it up. It's pretty awesome. The idea is to read a chapter in the Bible every day, and I guess it takes 929 days, which is like 3 years.
It's in the show notes on our website. Check it out.
Yeah, and that's like 3 years, so it's half the time. So you can, I agree with you. You don't know what you're going to be doing in 7 years, but maybe if you know what you're going to be doing in 3 years, you can at least address the Bible. But I love the idea of the Yiddish page a day. I love it. I love the TV show a day, and I love the way that gives you options to go, to various slices of Jewish life. So. But let's go back to the Yiddish stuff, because there's so much more to unpack. There's one piece of the Yiddish story, the Yiddish Book Center story, that I think is especially relevant to some of the things that we've been talking about on Judaism Unbound for so long. And I want to make sure that we talk about it before this episode ends, which is just the very existence of the Yiddish Book Center. So remember the story of David Siegelman from Moshe House, where he told us the story of how they almost ran out of money and closed Moshe House. And we said, what would the story of Moshe House have been if they actually had run out of money and closed? And they would have said, this whole idea wasn't good, and it makes no sense to work with young people. They're not interested in Judaism. And it would have had this huge effect on the whole area. But instead, because they succeeded, it made people say, hey, this is a really important age group. Let's do all kinds of things. And then Honeymoon Israel came up in that age demographic, and One Table and all kinds of other things are coming into that demographic. And we're actually seeing that is a demographic of people who are really interested in doing Jewish things. So I think it's really similar, the way that things must have been before Aaron Lansky founded the Yiddish Book Center. I mean, I think that we know that people are saying, Yiddish, it's a nothing, that's not going anywhere. And what I want to point out is that, number one, Aaron's tenacity, and the tenacity, I think, of others, was to say, I hear that you don't think this is a great idea. I think it's a great idea, and we're going to keep going. And they kind of kept going in a way that was sustainable for them, right? They rented if you read his book, which, by the way, it's called Outwitting History, everybody should read it. It's fantastic. It's so much fun. It's not a philosophical book. It's a book of stories of how this all happened. And it's just one of the funnest Jewish books, and maybe, any kind of nonfiction book that I've ever read. And you just kind of hear that they're these scrappy student types that have a truck that's basically falling apart and breaking down all the time. And they're driving around mostly the Northeast, and they're picking up books as much as they can fit in this truck. And they're carting them away. And it doesn't seem promising, for an organization that, down the road has its own buildings that are, air conditioned or whatever to preserve the books and all these kind of things that are, resource intensive. And so number one, this tenacity of the people who kind of keep going when the funders are not so excited about what they're doing is really significant. And the question is, it's sort of an ironic thing to say, but is there anything that funders could do to try to help those people remain tenacious, even though they aren't yet funding their organization? So I don't know. I put that out as a challenge to see if we can do something to get people through that kind of what you might say is like the R&D period, even when their idea might actually totally fail. But then the other piece that I think is interesting is like, what is the significance of the Yiddish Book Center and of just the whole story of Yiddish in America in its sort of rebirth in this generation? What is the story? What is the significance of it? Right. And one thing that you could say is like, hey, a lot of people are finding Yiddish really something that they have a passion for, and that's great. And it turns out that maybe the future is one where we're not going to have things that every Jew in America is going to love, where we're going to have a lot of areas that you could say are kind of niche, and it's going to be a flourishing Jewish world when we have a lot of other things like the Yiddish Book Center. So in my mind, Svara might be one of those, right? This idea that people are studying Talmud or that people are studying Talmud through a queer lens. Like, I don't know if that's going to be for everybody, but it's something that a particular group of people is extremely passionate about, and that group is growing. And it's growing beyond LGBTQ folks. How big will it grow beyond that? I don't know. In the same way that Yiddish is growing beyond maybe people who have an absolute passion for Yiddish, but is it going to grow a whole lot bigger than that? I don't know. But I love the idea of a Jewish world. And maybe this goes to your point about the different kind of daily practices, that, it would be great if we had 100 different daily practices. And it would be great if we had 100 organizations, each of which was totally different from one another, that were like the Yiddish Book Center, like Svara, like other organizations that have this kind of passionate group of people that is, not that big.
Good dream. Like it. I think that we should absolutely have that. And I keep on doing this. I'm trying not to be contrived about it, but I really do see a tie here to another one of the episodes in this unit, which is the one with Sandy Fox, where she talked about, it's not about doing it because it's popular or because it's practical or because it's useful. Like, follow something that you love because you love it. I forget which one of us asked her the question, but we were asking about like sort of the utility of Yiddish in one respect or another. And she was like, well, I don't do this because it like gives me X, Y, or Z skill. It's just, I like Yiddish. And I think that what you just said vibes really well with that. Do the Talmud study through a queer lens because like, oh my gosh, that speaks to my soul and I love it. If Svara had only ever reached a couple dozen people who loved every minute of it, Dayenu, that's enough. That's amazing. And I do think that we have a struggle, and it's a funding struggle like you talked about, but it's also like a psychological struggle in Jewish life and in general. It's not just how we do Jewish institutions. Like, we judge whether something has value by the number of people that say that it has value. I don't want to do that as much anymore. It's not that I want us to entirely write off considerations of what's going to speak to large populations as opposed to small ones. But like, yeah, I do think that the success story, the vision of Jewish futures, plural, that I envision for us is one in which we will have a lot of groups like you described, hundreds of organizations, hundreds of non-organizations, just groups of people that are finding deep value in some Jewish practice. And not that we will find the hidden secret main practice that everybody's going to align on and follow.
This aspiration to find, let's say, the magic bullet, the answer, right? The new Judaism, the way that everybody's going to get it, the thing that everybody's going to get engaged in, almost by definition, because we know, A, how different people are from one another, and B, how in the rest of society, people are able to get their niche interests met in this digital age, et cetera. How that if we're going to find one thing that every Jew or, huge numbers of Jews agree about, that thing is probably going to be pretty boring and pretty parv, so to speak. and unlikely to be something that generates passion. And I think that the problem that we're challenged with in Judaism today is a lack of passion. A lot of people are proud to be Jewish. A lot of people think that being Jewish is important in their life. But I don't think the Pew study, and I'm not aware of any studies that have asked a question along the lines of, is this your passion? Is this your, top 5 things that you care about in the world, or that you, not that you care about even, but that you love to do? Because there are things that I care about, but I don't really do them all that often because I don't actually love the doing. So it's interesting to think about what the world might look like where instead of finding a magic bullet, instead of trying to find a magic bullet, we're cheering for everybody, finding their passion.
What I've loved about this Yiddish series is that it took me off guard. Like, I knew we were talking about Yiddish, but I didn't expect that we would be looking at philosophical questions of shame, and that we would be talking. I mean, we had a whole thread about Esperanto and that the universalist language that whose inventor actually was a Yiddish speaker, and then created this attempt to bring the entire world together through a language. I mean, all of these threads that I did not expect to happen happened. As we close, I want to look at the title of this episode. So the title of this episode, Yiddish Nu. I mean it deeply. I've thought about how if I had to sum up Jewish life in one syllable, it would be new. And so it works in 3 different languages. And appropriate for this conversation is I like the Yiddish and the English ones better than I like the Hebrew. But I'm going to explain all 3. So in Yiddish, nu, I'm sure many of you listening know what it means. I don't know even how to translate it, but like nu? Question mark is so? Just like a sort of what? So yeah, it's just like like what? I mean, I don't even know how to distill it, but it's this interrogatory question that just in one syllable allows you to convey to somebody like, what's your deal? Like, what's happening? And I love that as an encapsulation of so many layers of Jewishness. Just the fact that it's kind of a question word links with a lot of things that I hold dear about this funky tradition of ours. So that's the Yiddish side. Then there's the Hebrew side, which nu as a suffix at the end of a Hebrew word is how you make something refer to like us or we. It's a pluralizing word. It's beyond just the me. It's a group-oriented piece. And without going into like peoplehood questions and all of that stuff that we've talked about on plenty of other episodes, I do think that part of what we get when we look at that side of Nu is we get a religious tradition, a Judaism that is very deeply invested in not just finding truths about the world that can be held by individuals, but building spaces where people share those with each other, where people share moments and practice with each other. So that's the Hebrew side. And then, y'all know where this is ending, the English side. Nu, N-E-W. That's a word that on this podcast couldn't be much more central. I think that our intuition sometimes is that religion, and especially Judaism, is where the ancient lives and where we preserve and conserve the past, and we don't so much look to create new N-E-W stuff. Our stance is very much that the process of living Jewishly in whatever forms that takes is largely a process where we ourselves have agency and we ourselves are creators of the new. So I kind of want to close this unit on Yiddish with that threefold set of news. So nu question mark in Yiddish, nu as a suffix in Hebrew, and nu as the adjective in English. Because what I've learned is that when we're talking about Yiddish, we're not really only talking about Yiddish. That's something I did not fully understand before this unit that I now do, which is that Yiddish automatically, because of its diasporic nature, ties us to other corners of the Jewish universe. And this is a call on the English side for us to really understand that we're not only looking backward, but we're looking forward to.
And I'll just say, I'm in.
There we go. So today we had Descendants of Shame, S-H-A-M-E, we had Nu, and we had Amen/I'm in as a translation of Amen. You'll have to go back to one of our earlier episodes to get the full context for that. So thank you so much for listening. We're going to close out this episode in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our Twitter feed at Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can always hit us up via email at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. Two quick reminders before we fully sign off. One is that we have our Kickstarter going, and we really hope that you'll support us to whatever extent you're able to at JudaismUnbound.com/book. And the other piece is just a huge thank you to the Yiddish Book Center. This was a fantastic unit of episodes. We really had a good time with all these guests that you helped us to identify. And we didn't come into this knowing exactly what to expect, but the result was really one that we're thrilled about. And we've heard a lot from listeners that it's resonated with them too, with you too, listeners. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.